Hello, I'm Michael Pierce, and this is The Human Condition. Our topic today is dystonia and alternatives for treating movement disorders. Movement disorders are a big problem in neurology, and in fact, there are specialists in neurology that are movement disorder specialists. A movement disorder is some kind of disorder that causes either a locking of muscles or a tremor and alternate motion of muscles that can be regional or it can be global. Now, you guys have had dystonia before, and we got a lot of requests for more topics on more discussion of dystonia, so I'm going to open it up and do a little bit more for those of you that want to hear, some more on dystonia. I will repeat myself quite a bit, but I think it's worth it. There are at least a dozen genes for dystonias, and there's probably two main ones, the DYT1 and DYT2 gene. And these genes, many people don't know, are prone to being activated by trauma. For some reason, the genes turn on and the histones open up, which are the things that hold the genes, and they begin to express themselves with trauma. So for some reason, the trauma and the inflammation opens up those genes and lets them turn on. And some people theorize that those genes can never be turned off once they're turned on. I'm not sure of that. I think that it's probably mostly true for our modern lifestyle, but we live in a pretty sick environment and we don't take care of ourselves very well. So I'm not convinced that it's always the case. I think that we will discover later on that if we do enough right things, like get rid of blue light like I'm doing with my glasses, or if we get more infrared light, if we change our diets, if we reduce our carbohydrates, if we get rid of glyphosate, if we get rid of adjuvants in the jabs, that we might find that we can actually, get better and reverse these genetic expressions that turn on in diseases like type 1 diabetes and in dystonia. So we know there's a genetic component, but it doesn't mean that you're stuck on that you have to have dystonia once it's happened. We do know that dystonias can be fairly dangerous in some people. They can progress to being so dangerous that the person just curls up in a ball and really can't get out of it. But that takes years usually. Most dystonias start in a focal region, like they might be an upper limb dystonia or a hemidystonia, half the body, or they might be a head and neck dystonia, where the head is turned like this. Or in some devastating cases, like I've seen from jab reactions, the person will have a twitch where their head comes down and turns. And I've seen this in many cases. It's not rare, unfortunately. So these are reactions of the basal ganglia. When a person has spontaneous movement that is not part of another movement that they volitionally do, like a conscious task like this, where they go to grab a pen or they lift a fork, and they do something that is intentional, we call that an intention tremor. So if you grab a pen or a fork and you bring it to your mouth and it shakes, and then when you just let your hand rest, it doesn't shake, that's an intention tremor. And intention tremors are usually based on the cerebellum, the back of the head here. And that's a very important part of the brain, and that's not the typical movement disorder. Those usually can be easier to treat with functional neurology. The movement disorders that are classic movement disorders that are of the basal ganglia are more difficult. And the reason for that is that the basal ganglia drives spontaneous movement at rest. So if you're just at rest and you're laying down and your hands are lying by your sides and they're tremoring, or your head is tremoring without any action, without sitting up, without doing anything, that's much more likely to be a basal ganglia problem. Now, Parkinson's disease fits in that category of basal ganglia, and of course, substantia nigra, which is part of the mesencephalon or the midbrain. But it's all part of a big circuit of a bunch of nuclei deep inside the brain that communicate with each other. And their job is to be kind of like the gas and the brake of the brain. There's a gas and a brake on each side. So one hemisphere is dominant, and then another hemisphere might be dominant depending on the task. You might have heard that people that are doing music will be more right brain dominant, or art. And then when they switch to doing like their checkbook or doing their taxes, they're going to be left brain dominant. These are general rules of thumb. They're not always the case, but they're general rules of thumb. And certainly people switch between dominances of the right and left hemispheres. But the general concept is that the basal ganglia has a direct pathway and an indirect pathway. And the direct pathway is like the gas. It's a way of a group of cells deep in the brain saying, I see a pattern up there in the cortex in the top of the brain that you do all the time, and I'm going to help you do it more efficiently by waking up those cells in a network. And then the indirect pathway does quite the opposite. It says, I see we need to dampen a bunch of things, So I'm going to send a dampening signal or inhibitory signal to a whole bunch of parts of the cortex or surface of the brain, telling those to turn off and to do less. And so that allows us to do movements while we stabilize other parts of our body. So, if we're trying to walk and chew gum, we don't want to fall over. We don't want to do all kinds of things. If we raise our arm, we don't want our spine to give way and let us fall over. So there's all kinds of things that our basal ganglia does to dampen movement and to stiffen our spine, or to make it less responsive, or to make it more responsive. So our spine is different than our limbs, which is different than our face and our jaw. So every time we do things like chew and bend and turn, we don't break off our teeth and bite off our tongue, because our brain knows how to do those things and knows how to inhibit certain things while firing other things. And that's a combination of the basal ganglia and the cerebellum working together. The basal ganglia is a lot more related to resting movements, movements that peak out and that escape the brain when you're supposed to be still. So when we see that overaction of the direct pathway, we know that that's one kind of problem. Now, one big question the interns always ask is, when we get Parkinson's is excess movement with a tremor. And yet Parkinson's is a decrease of the direct pathway and an increase of the indirect pathway, because the patient is basically shutting down movement. They're basically having a face that goes blank. They drool and they let saliva come out of their mouth. And they sometimes have problems with walking. They have to have a very stunted gait with very short steps. They have trouble going through thresholds. They have trouble expressing their emotions. All of their responses are slow. We call that bradykinesia, which is slow movement. And so when you see that type of thing happening in either dystonia or in Parkinson's or in any of the movement disorders, you have to ask yourself, why? Why are the basal ganglia cells screaming out to us, and what are they trying to tell us? Because, my greatest diagnosis teacher, Dr. Troy Tatum, always used to teach us that patients have written on their forehead what's wrong with them. If you have only eyes to see, you can understand what's wrong, because the cells are trying to talk to you. So if the cells are in there trying to tell you what's wrong, you've got to listen. So we know that basal ganglia cells are primitive. We know they don't handle toxins well. We know they don't handle heavy metals well. We know they don't handle trace rare heavy metals like mercury and cadmium and lead and arsenic. We know that they dysfunction greatly, and we know that they respond very poorly to pesticides and herbicides and solvents like paint thinner. We know that they respond poorly to oxidative stress, what's called the redox potential, which is the set of cells that we're studying more reducing or more oxidizing? And so whenever you take a supplement to change the oxidative reductive potential of your cells, these cells resist rapid change. So if you're thinking to yourself, I know that I'm a oxidative stress person and I'm having lots of oxidative stress, I'm going to take a reducing agent, I'm going to take an antioxidant, and I'm just going to bomb myself with antioxidants. Well, that's probably a good goal to achieve and aspire to over time, but it's not great to do the first thing right away rapidly, because all cells in the brain resist rapid changes in redox potential. They don't like it. So if a person takes an otherwise good supplement, and it could be anything from pycnogenol to vitamin C to N-acetylcysteine, I've even seen thyroid and other patients with dystonia that had dystonias take nebulized glutathione and give themselves a worse tremor because their basal ganglia responded too aggressively to the change in redox potential. You can't shove a person from oxidative stress to reducing chemistry rapidly. And if you do, you're going to get misfiring of those cells, and you're going to get more tremors and more weird outputs of the basal ganglia system that don't make sense. But they do make sense if you study redox potential. So, listen to the light people that talk about red light and blue light and infrared light and UV light, because they talk about how the mitochondria produce excess reactive oxygen species if you drive them too hard. So you might be taking supplements to drive ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is the energy molecule from the mitochondria, and so you're getting more energy, but you're also getting more reactive oxygen species because you didn't manage what the mitochondria need right by giving it enough antioxidants and by giving it enough infrared light. So that's one of the reasons that a person might do poorly. So it's important, yes, with dystonia to get more infrared sunlight and to get infrared lights on the head and infrared lights. We even have ones in brain science that go up your nose and shine into your brain, We've got lights that can shine on your abdomen. There's all kinds of artificial and regular lights. Certainly the sun is free and it's got way more red light than any device you could buy, but there are some really good devices out there too that can be very helpful. But you've also got to block the blue light. You know, I'm bathed in blue light right now, but I can't see it because I've got it blocked by the glasses. Now, bear in mind, we all have blue light receptors in other parts of our body outside our eyes that are triggered by this. So you can't just get by what I'm doing here. You have to limit the time you do this, and I certainly do. I don't sit in front of these lights and cameras all day long. I think it's important to realize that if we do lab tests for all of these toxins, and we detoxify them efficiently and retest with labs, we'll find that we can get quite a bit better. And I think you'll find that's a surprising answer to basal ganglia and movement disorder and dystonia problems. And I also want to mention that there's a great deal of neurorehab success done by chiropractic neurologists. Now, I serve on the board, the National Board for the American Chiropractic Neurology Board, and these opinions are my own and not theirs. However, it's important for you guys to consider going to the acnb.org website, American Chiropractic Neurology Board, and using the doctor locator to find doctors around the world that are chiropractors that have taken the extra step to receive a specialty, just like in medicine, where you do a period of residency and a period of testing and exam, very rigorous exam process to become a board-certified chiropractic neurologist and be able to do high-level neurological exams on people and work with patients that are very seriously injured or in degenerative states like dystonia and stroke and coma and the various types of degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. So there's a lot of hope and there's a lot of reversal of disease happening. In fact, if you haven't seen Dale Bredesen's book, The End of Alzheimer's, it's basically a diet book that talks about how to eat your way out of Alzheimer's. It talks about why people are getting essentially type 3 diabetes, which is insulin resistance in the brain that creates the Alzheimer's plaques and creates the damage that is the frontotemporal dementia. And by the way, dystonia and Parkinson's and Alzheimer's have a lot of similar chemistries to them when we do autopsies of the brain. So it's important to look at the fact that we can reverse a lot of that with sometimes very aggressive low-carb, keto, and carnivore modified diets for people. It's important to realize that the literature is not catching up to this right now, and there's a lot of resistance in the published literature to cases like this. So please go to ipac-edu.org and check out their ability for doctors to publish case studies. Check out their journal, Science, Public Health, and the Law, and that's a really important policy journal. And consider taking courses from ipac-edu.org. And I hope that you realize that there's a lot of hope, but it's different kinds of hope, and it involves really studying genetics and biochemistry and redox and light and mitochondria and toxins and toxicology and neurology and rehab. But there's a lot of hope for dystonia. Thank you.